Good afternoon, everyone. I am here before you to state categorically that Machiavelli is dead. For years, our thinking was distorted, presenting us with a false dilemma when designing public policies, where we had to choose between political efficiency, as opposed to respecting the ethical and moral values of the West. As Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto points out in his work on efficiency and dynamics, from this point of view, efficiency is not compatible with various schemes of equity or justice, but rather arises solely and exclusively from one of them, which is based on respect for private property and the entrepreneurial function. That is why the opposition between the dimensions of efficiency and justice is false and mistaken. That is, what is just cannot be inefficient, and what is efficient is just. In fact, from the perspective of dynamic analysis, justice and efficiency are two sides of the same coin. Without a doubt, the person who most clearly anticipated this situation was Murray Rothbard, when he pointed out the connection between the dynamic conception of economic efficiency and the realm of ethics. Rothbard considered it essential to first establish the proper ethical framework that drives efficiency. Dynamic given our lack of knowledge regarding ends, means, and policy, and the utility functions that exist in reality. Thus, for Rothbard, and I subscribe to this view, even in my role as president of the great nation, Argentina, only the ethical principles underlying Western culture can serve as a criterion of efficiency when making decisions regarding public policy. Put bluntly, when public policies are being designed, it is inadmissible from an ethical and moral standpoint to sacrifice justice on the altar of efficiency. This commitment to values is not only above economic efficiency, but is even far above, even more so, than political utilitarianism. Thus, by setting aside ethical and moral values, this leads to policies that are not only unjust, but also result in collapse. Not only economically, but also socially, to the point that it could ultimately bring about the end of Western civilization itself. That is why, in 2024, I pointed out at this forum that the West was in danger. In turn, in my 2025 presentation, I showed that the agendas and policies being promoted by various international organizations and forums were nothing more and nothing less than a whole set of socialist policies, elegantly wrapped to deceive people with noble and beautiful souls, with good intentions, but always with the same catastrophic results. That is why we must never forget the words of Thomas Sowell about socialism, to which he acknowledged the merit of sounding very nice, but whose ugly side is that it always ends badly, horribly badly, not to mention the ongoing disasters it causes. Because of socialism, during the 20th century, we see the appalling damage caused in Venezuela, and not just because of an 80% drop in its GDP, but even worse, with the establishment of a bloody narco-dictatorship whose terrorist tentacles spread throughout our entire American continent. That is why, today more than ever, in the face of the ethical and moral degradation that the West is experiencing as a result of having embraced the new socialist agenda, it is necessary to defend and promote the ideas of liberty. However, unlike how it was approached in the past, it must now be based on a utilitarian approach. Today, the defense of the capitalist free enterprise system must be grounded in its ethical and moral virtue. That is, as Israel Kirzner points out, today's socialists do not deny the productive superiority of capitalism. They criticize it for being unjust. Therefore, it is not enough for the system to be more productive, because if its foundation were unjust, capitalism would not deserve to be defended. Therefore, today I will show you that free enterprise capitalism is not only more productive, but it is also the only system that is just. In turn, I will show you that there is no dilemma between political utilitarianism and value-based politics, because if these were in conflict, it would mean that the foundations of political utilitarianism must be discarded for being unjust. Therefore, this means that if we want to emerge from our dark present, we must once again draw inspiration from Greek philosophy, embrace Roman law, and return to Judeo-Christian values, which will allow us to save the West. A large part of human conflicts arise from a failed interrelation between natural law and positive law. Thus, natural law is the law that should govern human beings because it aligns with their nature and therefore is just in a universal sense. It is a law common to all men because it is intrinsic to their essence and therefore unchangeable and immutable. On the other hand, positive law is the one written by men to suit their own convenience. In this way, when positive law is in harmony with natural law, there will be justice. Otherwise, it may be legal, but it will not be legitimate. Based on this, two fundamental rights are recognized: the rights to life and to liberty. Man is born alive and free and has the right to preserve these attributes of nature. Furthermore, he has the right for his fellow men to respect these in order to seek his own happiness, which is the goal toward which every man strives. In parallel, we have acquired rights which are neither natural nor inherent to human beings, but are earned by merit or obtained as a gift. In this way, the fundamental right to freedom is derived from the acquired right of private property, and this is manifested in our ability to freely acquire a good with the fruits of our labor, or we can receive a good that is freely given to us as a gift or inherited. In turn, the right to property, especially due to its dynamic consequences, is linked to the principle of appropriation of the log. So now property can not only result from a donation, gift, inheritance, or exchange, but also includes the appropriation of discovery and creation. Finally, these rights are complemented by the principle of non-aggression, which establishes that no human being has the right to exercise aggression of any kind against another human being, which not only includes physical aggression, but also all forms of coercion, compulsion, and any imposition under the threat of the use of force. That is why we define liberalism, or as Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch Jr. puts it, as the unrestricted respect for the life project of others based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the rights to life, liberty, and property, whose institutions are private property, free markets without state intervention, competition understood as free entry and exit, the division of labor, and social cooperation. Naturally, associated with this social order, the question arises as to whether it is just. Therefore, to determine if the system is just, the obligatory reference is to Ulpian, whose basic premise forms the foundation of Roman law and is undoubtedly one of the pillars of Western civilization. Thus, justice is the constant and persistent will to give each person their due, that is, the intention to give to each what is theirs, what corresponds to them. However, Ulpian's influence did not end there. He went on to add that the principles of law consist in living honestly without causing harm to anyone, and giving each person what is theirs. Therefore, from all this it follows that one of the characteristics of free enterprise capitalism is that it is a just doctrine. Given the emerging institutional framework, which we have also proven to be just, it is now time to demonstrate that it is also efficient. The first argument in this regard was made by Adam Smith, who, using the invisible hand argument, posited that each individual, by pursuing their own interest, leads to the greatest social welfare. Later, the neoclassicals, guided by an idea of the invisible hand based on Pareto optimality, managed to derive the first axiom of welfare economics. That is, every competitive equilibrium is Pareto optimal. However, this meant embracing a mathematical structure that left the door open to state intervention under the good intentions of correcting market failures, which from my point of view do not exist. To this end, the proof developed by Hans Gemma Hoppe, based on property rights and in line with the principle of original appropriation from the LOC, together with the non-aggression principle, is not only satisfactory in proving optimality, but also leaves no room for doubt that would allow for intervention. In this way, Hoppe points out that any deviation from this set of rules implies, by definition, a redistribution of property titles and therefore of income, from the users and contractors of goods to the non-users, producers, and non-contractors. Therefore, any such deviation implies that there will be relatively less original appropriation of resources whose scarcity is known, and therefore there will be less production of new goods, less maintenance of existing goods, and fewer contracts and trades that are mutually beneficial. A lower standard of living in relation to the goods and services that change hands. Furthermore, the postulate that only the first user, not the last, of a good acquires the right of ownership over it assures us that productive efforts will be as high as possible at all times. In turn, the notion that only the physical integrity of property, not its value, should be protected, guarantees that every owner will make the greatest productive efforts in terms of value, that is, efforts to promote favorable changes in the value of the property and to prevent or counteract any unfavorable change in its value. Therefore, any deviation from these rules implies a reduction in productive efforts at all times. Note that by focusing on private property and not on excess demand functions derived from optimization exercises, it is possible to achieve an optimum without the need for esoteric assumptions that later justify state intervention. At the same time, it avoids falling into the empirical absurdity of the second theorem of welfare economics, which posits the independence between production and distribution, as if the choice between capitalism and communism were neutral in terms of outcomes. Therefore, having proven that the institutions of free enterprise capitalism, upheld by natural rights, the principle of original appropriation of the OECD, and the non-aggression principle are not only just but also efficient, at least in static terms, it is now time to demonstrate that free enterprise capitalism fulfills all these same properties in dynamic terms as well. Xenophon, already 380 years before Christ, pointed out that economics is a knowledge that allows men to increase their wealth, while also asserting that private property was the most beneficial vehicle for each person's life. After that, Xenophon addresses the concept of efficiency, which he approaches from two perspectives. On one hand, from a static perspective, he defines efficiency as the management of available resources aimed at avoiding waste, and he also highlights the benefit of private property by stating that the master's eye is the best way to fatten his cattle. On the other hand, in his second definition of efficiency, Xenophon delves into the dynamic aspect, pointing out that efficiency also involves increasing the estate. That is, it is about increasing the available quantity of goods through entrepreneurial creativity, that is, through trade and speculation. This latter criterion of efficiency is fundamentally important for the study of economic growth, since unlike a static model in which only what Robert Lucas Jr. referred to as the deep parameters are considered, that is, preferences, technology, and initial resource endowments, in the dynamic sphere, both technology and initial endowments can change and, in fact, do so continuously as a result of entrepreneurial creativity. Moreover, a separate chapter is owed to the institution of private property, and building upon it the Austrian school of economics, from Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, Barquisar, Llope, all the way to Jesus Huerta de Soto, have demonstrated the impossibility of socialism, and therefore have debunked the phantasmagorical idea of John Stuart Mill, who posited the independence between production and distribution. An academic deafness that led to socialism and cost the world the lives of 150 million human beings. Meanwhile, those who managed to survive the terror did so in absurd poverty. In line with what has been stated and consistent with the second definition from Xenophon's analysis, economic theory has identified four sources of economic progress. First, we have the division of labor, which was exemplified by Adam Smith with the pin factory. Essentially, it is a mechanism through which productivity gains are generated, which manifest as increasing returns. And although its limit is set by the size of the market itself is positively affected. That is why. However, it is also worth clarifying that this virtuous process is not infinite, as its limit is constrained by the initial endowment of resources. Secondly, the accumulation of capital, both physical and human. With regard to physical capital, the interaction between saving and investment is crucial, highlighting the fundamental role of the capital market and the financial system in carrying out this intermediation. On the side of human capital, the focus should not be limited to education alone, but should also consider development. Thank you. Of cognitive abilities. From the moment a human being is born, their nutrition and health are fundamental elements in order to access education and the labor market. Thirdly, we have technological progress, which means being able to produce a greater quantity of goods with the same amount of resources, or to produce the same amount using fewer inputs. Finally, we have entrepreneurship, or rather the entrepreneurial function, which, according to Professor Puerta de Soto, it is the main driving force behind the process of economic growth, because although the three factors mentioned are important, without entrepreneurs, there would be no production, and the standard of living would be extremely precarious. Where the entrepreneurial function is not so much focused on short-term efficiency, but rather on the growth of the quantity of goods and services, which leads to higher standards of living. In light of all this, what is truly important is to expand the production possibility frontier as much as possible. Thus, dynamic efficiency can be seen as the ability of an economy to foster creativity and entrepreneurial coordination. In turn, the criterion of dynamic efficiency is inextricably linked to the concept of the entrepreneurial function, which is a typically human capacity. It is the ability to recognize profit opportunities that arise in the environment and to act accordingly to take advantage of them. This makes the task of discovering and creating new ends and means fundamental, driving a spontaneous coordination aimed at resolving market imbalances. On the other hand, this definition of dynamic efficiency that it proposes, Puerta de Soto, it appropriately and coherently combines Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction with Nord's adaptive efficiency. Naturally, given the role of the entrepreneurial function, the institutions under which it develops are of vital importance. In this sense, both Douglas North and Jesus Huerta de Soto see reducing uncertainty as a key function of institutions. Thus, while North presents it as a set of constraints devised by humans that structure social interaction in a repetitive way, Huerta de Soto considers that these institutions, conceived by human beings, emerge from a process of social interaction spontaneously, without the design of any single person, and that they reduce the uncertainty of the market process. In this way, as Roy Cordato points out, the appropriate institutional framework is the one that favors entrepreneurial discovery and coordination. Therefore, within this framework, economic policy should be oriented toward identifying and removing all artificial obstacles that hinder the entrepreneurial process, and voluntary exchanges. In this regard, given the decisive influence of institutions on economic progress, this draws our attention to the importance of ethics, since those societies that adhere to stronger moral values and ethical principles in supporting their institutions will be dynamically more efficient, and as a result, they will enjoy greater prosperity. Thus, the ethical issue is fundamental, as it is conceived as the pursuit of the best, a way to foster coordination and entrepreneurial creation. Therefore, in the field of social ethics, it is concluded that the conception of the human being as a creative and coordinating actor implies axiomatically accepting the principle that every human being has the right to appropriate the results of their entrepreneurial creativity. That is, the private appropriation of the fruits by those who create and discover, entrepreneurs, is a principle of natural law. Because if the actor could not appropriate what they create or discover, then their ability to detect profit opportunities would be blocked, and it would disappear the incentive they have to carry out their actions. Ultimately, the incentive they have to carry out their actions. In short, the ethical principle we have just stated is the fundamental ethical basis of the entire market economy. Therefore, what we have just demonstrated is that free enterprise capitalism is not only just, but also efficient. And moreover, it is the one that generates the highest growth rate. And so for that reason, given the conceptual framework of dynamic efficiency and the existence of dilemmas between efficiency and ethical values, when it comes to designing public policies, their implementation in real life becomes of interest. Beyond the enormous achievements we have shown during those years of management, eliminating a fiscal deficit of 15 points of GDP, reducing inflation from 300% to 30%, lowering country risk by 2,500 basis points, and growing the economy, while poverty dropped from 57% to 27%, we implemented public policies guided by ethical and moral values. I would therefore like to focus on the case of the Ministry of Deregulation, or as we call it internally, the Ministry of Increasing Returns. This ministry is inspired by the evolution of per capita GDP since the Christian era, which takes the shape of a hockey stick. This pattern arises from the fact that until the year 1800, per capita GDP was almost constant. And from that point on, it multiplied 15-fold in a context where the population size increased 10-fold. At the same time, while GDP was growing, extreme poverty fell from levels of 95% to 10%. However, this marvel implies the existence of increasing returns, which in economics is associated with concentrated market structures. And that's where the public policy dilemma arises between Pareto efficiency and justice. In the Panretian analysis, increasing returns imply the existence of non-convexities in the production set, which, let's say, prevents us from deriving profit functions that yield a maximum. As a result, neither the supply of goods nor the demand for inputs is optimal. In response to this, it is proposed to regulate companies and make them resemble a perfectly competitive case. That is, to eliminate increasing returns and with them economic growth. If you don't believe it, just look at the effects that regulation causes all over the world. The perspective based on the ethical values of capitalism points out that if such a position was achieved through discoveries, voluntary exchanges, and without violence in accordance with the non-aggression principle, there is no reason to justify intervention. In fact, intervention is a violation of property rights. So by punishing profits, the potential growth of the economy declines. Therefore, intervention and regulation are dynamically inefficient because they are violent and therefore unjust. That is why, since taking office in 2023, we have carried out, thanks to the tireless work of Minister Federico Sturzenegger, 13,500 structural reforms, which today allow us to have a more efficient and dynamically robust economy, enabling us to grow again. This is Make Argentina Great Again. Therefore, this shows how questionable the analysis of Pareto optimality is. Based on this, many consider it appropriate to regulate such concentrated structures, making their outcomes similar to those of a competitive model. However, as I previously pointed out, this means killing increasing returns, whose unintended side effect is to kill growth. Note that along these same lines, we can address issues related to artificial intelligence. In this sense, this tool could be seen as the 21st century version of Adam Smith's pin factory. In other words, a booster of increasing returns and with that, greater growth and well-being. Therefore, the most responsible thing that governments can do regarding this issue is to stop bothering those who are creating a better world. To put it more directly, politicians should stop bothering those who are making a better world. At the same time, I want to point out that all the fears associated with dystopian scenarios are nonsense. The answer is Adam Smith. The limit to increasing returns is set by the size of the market. And finally, we must not forget that the implementation of... And finally, we must not forget that the implementation of these projects requires real inputs and financial resources, so expansion will be limited by the initial endowments. For those who are interested in the theoretical foundations of these arguments I am presenting, today Dr. Riedel posted on social media precisely the work we did in collaboration. And in it, we developed precisely the theoretical foundations of this, that regulation kills growth. That is, the omnipotence of the state, the regulations destroy property rights, and that kills increasing returns. And therefore, let's say growth is lower. Lastly, connected to this phenomenal future that lies ahead, the role of human capital is of vital importance. In this regard, in Argentina, thanks to the work of Minister Sandra Petuelo for vulnerable sectors, we have stopped giving them fish and instead are teaching them how to fish and, if possible, motivating those who believe in their own business, fishing business. Finally, despite popular criticism, free enterprise capitalism, it does not undermine values, moral values. After all, economic progress and the mechanism of the invisible hand arose from Adam Smith's moral sentiments, and the modern era owes its existence to the bourgeois virtues highlighted by McCloskey. In turn, thanks to the great work of Huerta de Soto in developing the concept of dynamic efficiency and its practical application in Argentina, this allows us to be certain that the dilemma between efficiency and justice is false. that his markets are not only superior in terms of productivity, but they are also just. And therefore, public policies should be guided by ethics and not by utilitarianism, whether economic or political, as these always lead to unjust, populist, and impoverishing solutions. Therefore, I reaffirm what I said at the beginning of this conference. Machiavelli is dead. Therefore, it is time to bury him. Moreover, given the deep connection between morality and free markets, ultimately, they make us better people, since thanks to dynamically efficient markets, we can simultaneously achieve economic progress, defend private property, maintain peace, attain social harmony, and strengthen those social virtues that are indispensable for a prosperous society. Finally, I want to leave you with a reflection on this week's parasha. The parasha describes the moment when Moses confronts Pharaoh, the symbol of the oppressive power of the state, to warn him that if he did not free the Hebrew people, the last 3 plagues would befall Egypt. When Pharaoh refused, the plague of locusts came, which signifies famine. Then came the plague of darkness, which signifies the loss of clarity in decision-making. Finally, the plague of the death of the firstborn. This clearly demonstrates the fate of a society that denies freedom. The analogy with what is happening today in the West is strikingly clear. For some time now, the West, for some strange reason, began to turn its back on the ideas of freedom. And that is why, in this very place, in the year 2024, I stated that the West is in danger as a result of having embraced increasing doses of socialism in its most hypocritical form, which is wokeism. In turn, in 2025, I explained the mental parasites that the left has sown in humanity. However, 2020 is the year in which I bring you good news. The world has begun to wake up. The best proof of this is what is happening in America with the rebirth of the ideas of liberty. Therefore, America will be the beacon of light that reignites the entire West, and in doing so will repay its civilizational debt with a show of gratitude toward its foundations in Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Judeo-Christian values. We have a better future ahead of us, but that better future exists only if we return to the roots of the West. That is, by returning to the ideas of liberty. May God bless the West, may the strength of heaven be with us, and long live freedom, damn it. Thank you very much.